Karen Percy, Late Line.
Facing a union-led blitzkrieg last year against its radical industrial relations agenda, the former government concentrated a large part of its ad budget on a scare campaign on union dominance over the Labor Party. Well, now the dust has settled on the ballot boxes, it's clear that some within the Labor Party actually agree the unions do hold a disproportionate sway over them. Now Mark Ahrens, a former union official and former senior advisor to the New South Wales Premier, has written an incendiary essay on union power in the ALP for a new book called Dear Mr Rudd. Ahrens' message to P.M Rudd is clear. To hold on to office in the long term, Rudd will have to democratise his party and rein in the union power, which Ahrens says has now become so pernicious that it threatens to grow into a cancer. Well, we invited Mark Ahrens to debate the issue with Union's New South Wales Secretary and party heavyweight John Robertson. They joined us just a short time ago. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening, Tony.
Now, Mark Ahrens, tell us why you think it's time to cut the Gordian knot between the political wing of the ALP and the unions.
Well, I think that the system as it operates is actually wrong in principle. It is one in which a very small club, the Union Secretaries Club, of which John is a member, control 50% of the policy vote at state and national conferences, exert enormous day-to-day administrative and political policy influence on Labor governments, and play an enormous role in putting forward candidates for election in safe Labor seats and for upper houses in states and the Senate federally. And I think that this is a most undemocratic system. It's one in which a handful of union secretaries exercise power that is not given to them by their members. Their members have no say in their affiliation to the Australian Labor Party. Their members have absolutely no say on which faction their union secretary belongs to, or which fraction of their faction they intrigue with about what policies and what members of parliament they want to get up. It's also, I think, just absolutely true that unions have reduced their influence in the workforce. A quarter of a century ago, when Bob Hawke was elected, they had 50% of the workforce as members of unions. Today, it's down to 20%. Which is inflated by very strong and large membership in the public sector unions.
I'll come to those numbers in detail first. I want to get, since you've brought John Robertson straight into it as a member of the Secretaries Club, let me first of all ask you, do you accept that you're part of a Secretaries Club? Because there's a clubbish sort of aspect to all of this, isn't there?
Well, I think part of this is the rhetoric. I mean, we had the IR Club under John Howard, now we've got the Secretaries Club. The fact is that the union founded the Labor Party. The union movement is still the basis upon which the Labor Party is connected to working people. The union movement, even at 20%, is still the largest single body of organised people in Australia. It connects the Labor Party to people like nurses, teachers, retail workers, electricians, plumbers. Connects them in a way...
You don't dispute the 20% figure then, obviously.
There's no denial of the figure. I mean, it's an ABS figure, it's there, and we have to deal with that. But the reality is it's still a connection that provides the Labor Party with access to something that no other party has.
But how does 20% of the workforce translate into 50% of the power when it comes to ALP conferences?
Well, we had Simon Crean deal with this 60-40 issue down to 50-50. The fact is that it is the union movement that actually makes the Labor Party a Labor Party. It is the values that are entrenched in there, it's the policies, it's the interests. The fact is, at the last election, what we saw was John Howard run a scare campaign about union bosses, 70% of Labor's front bench being made up of union bosses, and what we saw was that argument overwhelmingly rejected by the public. I know Mark, in his chapter in this book, talks about some anecdotal evidence when he was at the Melbourne Cup having a beer, but the fact is that people rejected this overwhelmingly. Labor got one of the biggest swings to it at this election when all John Howard had to run on was this scare campaign about union bosses, union thugs, and 70% of the front bench being made up of union bosses. It was rejected.
Mark Ahrens, it has to be said that the case you're making now could well have been made by the former government in the lead up to the election. Many of the lines in your essay could have come from Tony Abbott specifically. I can remember him saying things like that during the campaign. I mean, how hard is it for you, with such a long connection to the party to come out and say these kind of things?
Well, these are things that have been well known for many, many years, and the more that union membership declines, the worse it gets. I need only remind John of the things that he said back in 2005 when what was then the New South Wales Labour Council, that he was the secretary of, changed its name to Unions New South Wales. That was based upon extensive research that was conducted by Ozpol that demonstrated definitively that vastly more of union members voted for parties other than the Labour Party in the 2004 federal election. This was one of the driving moments for John in deciding that you couldn't associate unions with Labour. Yet tonight he wants to sit here and argue that it's the very basis of Labour's connection with the workforce. Well, that clearly can't be the case, because it's well known and been well known for the last 15 years that union members vote pretty much well like the rest of the electorate.
Well, while you've got the floor, let me, before I bring you back in, John Robertson, you write, Mark Aarons, it is no exaggeration to say that the power exercised by some unions on the ALP has now become so pernicious it threatens to grow into a cancer, and a cancer, you say, that will threaten the future of the Rudd government. Why is that? And
well,
why put it in such strong terms?
Well, for very important reasons. While John talks about the connection back to the workforce and it being central to what makes up Labour, he isn't admitting to the fact that there has been enormous social change in this society that means, in his words, going back to 2005, that young workers in particular do not associate well with trade unions or with the Labour Party. And that was one of the reasons why he decided, I think quite rightly, to change the name of his organisation. Now, he made reference, for example, to me having a few beers with a couple of young workers on Melbourne Cup Day, and their attitude was absolutely unequivocal. They hated work choices, they hated being on the AWAs, they knew down to the last dollar and cent what the difference between the award was and what they were getting under work choices. But when the issue of trade unions came up, they were blistering in their scorn about unions. They just did not want P.M Rudd to take any notice of trade union bosses. Now, my thesis is a very simple one. This is a group of workers, young workers, who are there to be won by the trade union movement independently from the Labour Party. The Labour Party needs to connect to these workers, needs to bring them into a position of permanently voting for them over the next generation if it wants to transform itself into the natural party of federal government.
John Robertson, well, I should let you, first of all, right of reply.
Well, firstly, I mean, we changed the name to Unions New South Wales largely because there was a level of confusion. Every time you find yourself arguing with a Labor government, I'm sure most people listening were confused. Why is the Labor Council arguing with the Labor government? And so it was about actually some clarity. There was a move to draw a distinction between the union movement and the Labor Party. But there's a couple of points worth making. Firstly, we recognise we need to tap into young people when it comes to organising them into the union movement, and that's one of the challenges. But what we saw with the Rights at Work campaign over the 3 years in the lead up to last year's election was that we became the voice for working people. We were talking to people around the country who weren't union members but were concerned, and Mark reinforces that point.
But what about the practicality of how that actually translates into Labor Party power? And even though, and you've admitted, I think it's 20% representation in the workforce, it's lower in the private sector, but in the party itself, because of you only have the affiliated unions, it's down to 10 or 12%, is it not?
Well, Mark says 10 or 12%. I haven't done those figures to look at that, but what I can say to you is this, that in the end, the Labor Party is the party of the union movement. It is the party that has that connection with the unions. The unions, contrary to what Mark says, don't stack out branches and those sorts of things. Mark's chapter's written slightly jaded and on, you know, a cross between, I think the start of it's a bit like Pauline Hanson, I'm not anti-union, but, well, Hanson used to say I'm not a racist, but the second thing is that it's a jaded view, and I think it's based on one person's experience. I think the overwhelming view within the Labor Party, even people in the branches, would tell you the last thing they want to see is the union movement removed from the party. It is the heart of the party. The majority of people in unions freely choose to join. They know about affiliation and those sorts of things. We don't have closed shops anymore. We actually have to go out and convince people to join. These people know what they're doing when they join their unions, whether they are or aren't affiliated to the party. The unions are democratic. Every 4 years there are elections.
But
you
the
get to vote
party's
these people
the party's
out.
not democratic is the point that Mark Ahrens is making.
Well, I think the party is democratic.
Nor are the unions democratic, because if you are a member of a union that is affiliated to the Labor Party, you have absolutely no say in the fact that some of your money that you're giving to the union goes to the ALP for affiliation. You have absolutely no say on who represents you at a state or national conference. That is the plaything, the preserve of the union secretary. You have absolutely no say in whether or not you vote for one faction or another, or one policy or the other. And I'm sorry to say this, but historically, particularly the right-wing unions in this country have betrayed the rank and file of the Labor Party on successive occasions. One need only remember the special federal conference that was called when the Hawke-Keating government wanted to privatise the Commonwealth Bank. And there was no way, if only the rank and file had been represented at that national conference, that they would have supported that. But the trade unions voted for it in order to help out that government.
And this is my point about a jaded view. I mean, Mark's filthy about what happened about at the Commonwealth Bank. The fact is you can't put the sins of the father on the son. That was 20-something years ago. The union movement has recognised we need to move forward.
Let's move forward. Let's talk about right now. Yep. Why should you not have direct elections, as you do now for the president of the ALP, for a whole series of posts within the party?
Well, I think that's a debate for the party to have as a whole. The fact is that I would think there'd be a lot of political leaders from Kevin Rudd down
you couldn't actually come to a non-factional
be
conclusion unless you had a direct vote on changing it, could you?
Well, I think part of it is that if you look at the union movement, certainly in New South Wales, it no longer behaves in a factional way. It does not behave factionally left and right. It behaves as a movement. That's the first point that's worth making. The second thing is some of the things Mark suggests in his book, like, you know, we ought to have Greens in the party and we ought to have this group in the party. I don't think too many of the leaders would be terribly keen on those groups being in the party influencing the policies that Kevin Rudd or Morris Yemma or Mike Rann or any of the other premiers might have to implement. The fact is that the party at the moment is representative. The union movement provides the party with that opportunity to reflect a broader view than would be the case in any other political party.
Okay, Aaron, so just briefly on this, because I want to move on quickly to the broader argument that you make, that this leaches up into the administration of government. The undemocratic nature of the party has an effect on the administration of government. Tell us how.
Well, I think it's fairly simple. When you're at a state or national conference of the Labor Party and the trade union movement has got 50% of the vote, it's practically impossible, particularly if, as John maintains, it doesn't act as in a factional way, that it needs to get practically no other votes to get its policies up. And once it gets its policies up, it can enforce those policies through threat against government. And it does so, has done so. It's done historically, and it will continue to do so. And it has an effect where the larger part of the electorate, and remember the electorate is vastly bigger than the workforce even, there's young people, students, retired people, women who are out of the workforce, so it doesn't represent the whole plurality of the policy making that I think a modern centre-left party in a modern 21st century democracy should be aiming for, when the trade union movement can enforce its will through a very simple motion of having 50%.
John Robertson, let me put that to you in the form of a question. I mean, having helped Kevin Rudd into power, and with such significant help from the union movement, with huge amounts of money, for example, put into advertising, etc., etc. What does he now owe the union movement?
Well, I don't think he owes the union movement anything. He owes working families a lot. It was working families, union and non-union members, who voted Kevin Rudd into power. That campaign didn't just simply tap into union members, it touched a chord with a whole range of people who haven't historically been union members. I travelled for 3 years around New South Wales in a bus, and I had people coming up and talking to us saying for the first time in their life they were going to vote Labor because of work choices. So we were talking and representing a broader view than simply union members or people who traditionally voted Labor. That's why Labor won. Kevin Rudd owes us nothing.
Well, if he owes you nothing, and if he doesn't set up a formal relationship between his government and the union movement, and if he further tries to democratise the party, as Tony Blair did in Britain, will you back him?
I think there's a question about democratising, then there's a question about Blair, who ignored policy that was determined by his conferences. And there are two parts to this. I think it's appropriate to democratise the party. If Rudd wants to talk about how that might occur, I think that's a debate we ought to have. I don't think we want to get to the point like the British Labor Party where you've got those conferences and forums, and I think this is one of the risks with Mark's proposal, where you get all sorts of wacky ideas being debated, policies being adopted that the parliamentary party is not required to comply with. That's the British model, and I think that's pretty frightening.
All right, let me once again...
That's not my position, and okay, there are some gross distortions that John has actually perpetrated in putting forward my views. I'm certainly not someone who says I'm not anti-union, but I believe passionately in unions, and I believe that they have an important role to play, and actually that one of the things that holds them back is that too many senior trade union officials tramp around in factional politics inside the Labor Party, and that really is something that keeps them inside the hothouse atmosphere of Labor politics instead of looking outwards to young workers who actually have contempt for them. Secondly, I haven't proposed that Greens should be brought into the Labor Party, merely that if there is to be a structure in which the trade unions, say, for example, never have more than the level of workforce power inside the Labor Party, 20% of affiliated unions, for example, or 12% if my figuring is right, then there should be consideration to making it a more modern party in which there are some formal structures. The environment is a major issue right across the board for Australians, where those inside the Labor Party who are environmentalists might likewise get some sort of formal representation in the policy processes. So I think that I would urge people, rather than relying upon John's rather distorted version of my essay, to read either the Sydney Morning Herald on Saturday that's got an extract from it, or the book itself, where the full chapter in Robert Mann's Dear Mr Rudd is contained.
Yes, and we can't let you read out the whole essay tonight, or indeed describe everything in it, but Mark Ahrens and John Robertson, although we've only scratched the surface of what is still a live debate in the Labor Party, we thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Tony.